In February, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And he's come up here and tailored this talk for us. I told him what a bunch of reprobates you were, and he's fine-tuned it to that level.
I've got the car revving up outside, just in case.
Chris, do you need a stool or something like that?
No, I'll lean back here, I'll be fine.
Yep, okay.
If I'm down there, I'm a little bit out of the way, so I'm happy enough up here.
Any more gin, are you?
We'll see how that one goes first, shall we?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Roe.
Thanks everybody for coming this afternoon, evening. Basically, when Alan got in touch, he just wanted me to give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of research that's going on in parapsychology. So if you like, that's the scientific wing of this interest in psychical research, to give you an idea of what kinds of approaches and methods we might be using, but also what kinds of results we're getting from the studies that we're conducting. Certainly, although we've got a kind of projector and a screen and everything, I see this as very informal. So if at any stage there are questions that you might have, do feel free to ask them if you want to make comments. We're not desperate to get away particularly early, so if you have questions, we're quite happy to stick around and answer questions as well, as much as we can. And we thought we'd plant in the middle of this a little bit of a demonstration of how we might evaluate a dream ESP session. So hence Alan circulated a PDF, which was a kind of a dream diary, and we simply asked you to jot down any dreams you might have remembered from last night. During last night, the laptop randomly selected a video clip from among about 128, something like that, clips that we have as our target pool, and played that continually through the night. It's a 1-minute clip. It plays about every 20 minutes or so for about 6 hours through the night time, and that acts as some kind of psychological tag as your target. And we're going to use that to give you a sense of how we go about evaluating our participants' dream ESP mentations in a typical experiment. So we'll talk about that a bit later. When people talk about ESP testing, I think this tends to be the most typical view people have. This idea of guessing cards and seeing how many of those cards you can guess correctly. This is certainly how parapsychology began in the late 1920s and through the 1930s. J.B. and Louisa Ryan established a parapsychology unit at Duke University in the States in North Carolina, and they were looking for a method that moved them out of the seance room. Because although some of the phenomena were very interesting, it was inherently a very ambiguous situation, and also mystical in a pejorative sense, in a sense that most psychologists in university departments wouldn't be interested to participate in. There was a sense that something wasn't quite right, this wasn't how science was practiced. And so they arrived at a number of methods that instead seemed fairly clean, fairly rigorous, fairly regimented, looked like the kinds of psychology experiments that were being conducted in the university departments across North America. In that sense, they hoped that they would devise a protocol or method that would be attractive to other researchers, to other psychologists. You don't have to believe my findings, my results. You don't have to accept my credentials or my honesty. Instead, all you need to do is use my materials and test it for yourself. Recruit your own participants, run your own experiments with your graduate students, and see how it works out for you. If psi is real, then you'll find the same results I have. If psi isn't real, then we'll discover that between us, and the world will be a better place. We'll have moved on either way. The problem with this kind of approach, though, is that it doesn't bear much relation to the kinds of experiences that people typically reported. So, for example, if you met somebody at a party and they had some particularly troubling psychic experiences, maybe they'd had a near-death experience, an apparitional experience, maybe they'd had a premonition about something which was very negative, a death or injury of a relative, then turning around and describing all these p-values and significances from some card guessing doesn't really resonate with their experience. It doesn't allow them any insight into their phenomena. So, although this was a very interesting approach and invested us with a sense of rigour and structure, it's kind of had its time and we've moved on. Instead, what we did really was go back to basics, start from the ground and work up, and discover what it is that people were actually reporting. So when J.B. Ryan was conducting those kinds of card guessing experiments and getting a lot of publicity for it through the 30s and 40s in America, their first book, Extrasensory Perception, that came out in 1943, was actually the Reader's Digest book of the month for a month in the US. It was incredibly popular, it was picked up by a lot of people. A lot of people knew then about the Ryan's Research Centre, and they would volunteer accounts of experiences of their own. They just write to JB and say, I don't know if you'd be interested in my story, but this happened to me. I don't know what to make of it, but I'll give you an honest account of this experience. And Louisa Ryan, JB's partner, his wife, she collected these together. Not as evidence. She didn't treat them as if, in a kind of bundle of sticks way, that if we get enough of these cases, then maybe it'll count as evidence for precognition, or... Sorry, do people know what I mean by things like precognition, yeah. ESP, that's okay? That this would be evidence...
Sorry, could I have a clear definition?
Of course, okay. So what we would normally do in parapsychology is start with an overarching term, which is psi, PSI, which is simply the Greek letter, which we use in an algebraic sense to stand for that which is not yet known. Okay? So psi would mean there's something here going on that we don't understand, but within that we can have a kind of a taxonomy. So traditionally we separate psi phenomena into two categories. We have ESP and we have PK. So ESP stands for extrasensory perception, and extrasensory perception seems to involve situations in which people are able to acquire information from their environment in ways other than through the normal senses and through inference. So you know something that you shouldn't ordinarily know by whatever means. And PK is, if you like, the reverse of that. It's where you seem to be able to exercise some influence on the world, so the direction is outwards instead of inwards, again without using the normal psychomotor systems. So clearly you can cause things to happen because you interact with the world, but here it seems to be the act of intention alone that changes something. An area that we're very interested in Northampton that reflects that is the idea of distant healing, for example. So the idea of channeling energies or focusing positive thoughts for somebody who's suffering in some way, can that lead to some kind of change in their condition? Okay. And then finally within ESP, this idea of receiving information, we commonly separate that into three, but perhaps four different categories. So the three categories we work with are telepathy, which is simply the idea that you're acquiring information from the mind of another person, something they're thinking about, something they're experiencing, you also seem to know or experience. We have clairvoyance, where some information exists in the world, but maybe isn't known by anybody, and you seem to be able to acquire that information. So, for example, a lost object, or maybe from a previous era, something like that. But that might confuse things, because the third category is precognition, where you might have information that at this point in time doesn't exist. So a classic example of that might be that you have a premonition about a future event, and then later on that event transpires. So those would be the categories. And the fourth one that Chuck Arlington came up with was that ESP stands for error someplace. Maybe sometimes we're actually mistaken. We think something meaningful has happened, but in fact we can explain it in normal terms. Okay, so those are the kind of categories. And what Louisa did, which was really useful, was to categorise those cases. She fully understood that actually people may be mistaken, sometimes in superficial ways, but sometimes in important ways, in the earnest accounts that they're often giving. But if we collect enough of these cases, then those mistakes will tend to create noise, and what will tend to emerge is the pattern, the consistencies from case to case. And that might not be evidence in itself, but might give us cues to how we should design our own experiments, what things we should focus on when we're conducting and designing research. But the key still is the idea that we need controlled research, where we've got a better sense of what factors might affect or contribute to the outcome, so we can be very sure if something happens that it's not very easy to explain in normal terms, that it does suggest some new process.
What category would be OBEs, out-of-body experiences? Does that
Okay.
have a category?
It doesn't. Some people are interested in OBEs because some OBEs, for example, might involve the acquisition of information. The standard view of OBEs in parapsychology, as much as that could be thought of as standard, is that out-of-body experiences do not involve the shift of any point of consciousness out of your body. That those experiences can be created through some combination of psychic acquisition of information and the creation of a worldview. Some people also talk about near-death experiences in very similar ways. That actually we're very used to the idea that the seat of our experience is behind our eyes, somewhere between our ears, but that's a construction based on the fact that our sense experience is dominated by vision. That actually if you spend a lot of time, for example, in a sensory isolation tank, you can have some really interesting but quite strange experiences as your centre of consciousness can move around a little bit and your sense of your body changes quite a lot. So people tend to regard that part of the OBE as not proven, but there are certainly OBE cases where people come back claiming to have experienced things. So for example, to have seen things in a house that they've never physically visited, that kind of idea.
I've got a friend of mine who lives around, well, he's a police officer, serving police officer around here actually.
Right.
And several years ago he was very much into out-of-body experiences, and he'd focus and be able to take his mind out of his body at night time and travel into people's houses and tell his colleagues what number page in their book they were reading.
Right.
And the next day go into work, the local police station, and tell them what page they're up in their book, and they thought, you're weird, how can you do that? But he reckons that he was doing it via out-of-body experiences. So,
I mean, the wonderful thing about that is, I think it's very straightforward to devise a study that could evaluate that very explicitly. There was some work, I mean, this is an aside, sorry for this, for people who are not interested, but Carlos Osis, who was working in the States, he was at the American SPI in New York. He was very interested in out-of-body experiences and set up a number of studies where the participant was asked to go out of body and acquire information from this other location, but the information that you acquired would depend on how you observed the situation. It was set up as a visual illusion, so that if you literally saw what you were looking at, you would come back with one answer, but if you actually in some way acquired the information psychically, you wouldn't come up with the same answer because you wouldn't see the illusion. And what Osis reported was that people came back with the illusory answer, as if in some sense they were physically seeing what was to be seen there. So that's kind of interesting. And a very final little aside, probably the nicest study of out-of-body experiences that I know of is of a guy called Keith Harari, who's also known as, he's a mainstream psychologist in the States these days, but he was an out-of-body experiencer back in the 70s. And he ran a study in which a colleague of his, who was my ex-supervisor, Bob Morris, took his kitten and was watching his kitten in one space, and he would go out of body at randomly determined times and go through and comfort the kitten. And then he would go back to the body. And later on, when they actually looked at the assessments of the behaviour of the kitten was more calmed during those randomly selected times than equivalent times. What we make of that, I've no idea. I mean, it's not, clear supporting evidence for the notion of something travelling out of body, maybe other ways of explaining it. But certainly people would be interested.
Did your friend ever catch any thieves?
That's a good question. Yes.
Actually, he was time reading books.
Chris, are you okay with questions at this
Of
time?
course, just whatever suits really. I'm
Okay.
quite happy with that, yeah.
Right.
So what did we discover from Louisa Ryan? Well, for the subject of today's talk, the primary thing that she picked up on was the idea that the majority of experiences people reported from lay people, they might only have one or two experiences in their whole lives, and certainly didn't have any pretensions to being psychic. They typically involve dreams or other shifts of ordinary waking states of consciousness. So they might be involved in some kind of monotonous task, for example. They might be mildly daydreaming, those kinds of things. They might be in a kind of state of hypnagogia, so they're not quite asleep yet, but they're kind of just napping in the afternoon, this kind of idea. Or it may be a fully fledged dream. Those were very commonly the circumstances in which people reported experiences. They tended to concern people they were emotionally close to. That's very difficult to tease out because, of course, if it wasn't someone they were close to, and unless it was a significant event, you might never know about it. So, for example, if you have a dream that Mel Gibson stubs his toe, how are we ever going to know whether that might have been confirmed, unless you know Mel Gibson? So for most of us, it may be that tends to elevate some of those figures a little bit. But it does seem to be the case that people we're emotionally close to, we're more aware of in these states, and it tends to reflect serious rather than trivial events. Harvey Irwin summarises this later on in the 90s by saying that findings are consistent with the idea that extrasensory experiences are facilitated by an unforced engrossment or absorption, either in one's mentation, so your own thought process, your attention is focused inwards, or in a repetitive, highly practiced motor act. So if you're doing something you've done lots and lots of times before, doesn't require many cognitive resources, and your mind is drifting onto other things in a very idle way, not in a concerted way, those tend to be the circumstances in which you're going to have these surprising experiences pop up. Other circumstantial evidence to support a role for altered states or non-ordinary waking states involve, for example, an association with meditative practice that can be traced back to the Vedas of ancient India. Patanjali's sutras, for example, talk about siddhis, so the idea that as you are on a spiritual journey, as you develop spiritually, so you're more likely to experience paranormal powers of various sorts, and your sense of the nature of the world and your connection to others and to it changes, but they're distractions from the primary goal of spiritual development. Also, the ESP components of mystical states following shamanic rituals and ingestion of psychedelics, things like ayahuasca, for example, peyote, these kinds of substances that allow people to trip out in particular ways. They can encounter other realities, other worlds, and often come back with information from those sources that they claim is of some beneficial value. So, for example, new treatments for illnesses and these kinds of things are not uncommon in those states, and clearly are very current today, certainly in South America. And also early successful tests by people from the founding of the SPR, and even slightly before, where they were very interested in mesmerism, so an early form of hypnotism. During this state, people can be given suggestions, and those suggestions can include that they are able to go out of body and visit a remote location. They are able to know the thoughts of another person who's physically separated. And all our normal checks and balances, the normal ways in which we recognise that that's ridiculous, and of course I can't do that, and therefore I can't, are pulled out of the way in some way. And there are some incredibly impressive, albeit slightly anecdotal accounts from that period that are in the annals of the SPR. And then finally we have trance states of mediums. Not all mediums go into trance, we were talking about this briefly before, but certainly some mediums, and some of the more famous mediums in particular, like Mrs. Piper, would regularly have some degree of amnesia about the communications that she'd been producing while in a sitting. So Chuck Arnerton, over here, he tried to piece together what these different circumstances had in common that might relate to a facility to be psychic, to have psychic experiences. And this is an incredibly important stage, I think, in the development of parapsychology, and maybe isn't completely appreciated by some of the people who are working in the field today. Basically, Chuck had two key ideas. One is the idea that many of these various circumstances involved a kind of a damping down of stimulation. So people might have their eyes closed, for example. They might be relaxed so that there's not much going on physically to their body. They kind of tone down maybe cognitive concerns. They're not overthinking things. They're not preoccupied with worries. And so there's a general damping down of activity and a forcing of attention inwards, more of an introspection, and maybe a greater awareness of what's going on within. Crucially, his theory, which I think was a big twist, was this notion that in the past people were looking for ways to get participants to be psychic, to generate psychic impressions. And Chuck suggested that actually maybe what's going on is that we're continuously being psychic, that we continuously have access to this kind of information, much as we continuously have tactile information, but most of the time we're not aware that we've got weight pressing on our shoulders from our clothes, that our body is adopting a particular posture and so on, because it's relatively irrelevant until you're meditating and you're doing a body scan exercise, and suddenly you become intimately aware of the feelings in your knee or your big toe. But those sensations are constantly present and are available to you, you're just not directing your attention to them. And Chuck suggested that that might be a more useful model here. But what these situations have in common is the idea that they damp down competing sources of information and shift our attention towards this psychic source of information, which is always there and needn't be created or generated, but isn't ordinarily attended to, or in the kind of parlance of people like Huxley, tend to get filtered out in our perception.
That's quite a difference, isn't it? That's quite a change.
It is, I think so, and I don't think it's as appreciated as it could be in the field. Okay, brilliant. So that gives us a starting point. The other thing we need to be aware of is that when we defined the different forms of psi before, we essentially adopt a negative definition. So we tend to say that psi is that which occurs when we've ruled out all the normal explanations. So we're pretty confident normal communication couldn't be possible, and yet communication occurs. So it crucially depends on our skill in identifying what those normal means of communication are and effectively placing barriers to their occurrence. And so that's where this kind of barrier model fits in. And it's very easy for us to be rather sloppy and have maybe porous areas of this. So just to give you a couple of examples, if you had somebody who came to the department and said, I had this amazing experience, I was listening to the radio, I've suddenly started thinking about my school days, I thought of this friend and I haven't thought of her for 25 years. And lo and behold, the phone rang and it was her. I couldn't believe it. What are the chances? I honestly have not thought of that person for at least 10, 15 years. And there she was on the phone just immediately after I started thinking of it. Well, of course, what we might wonder is whether the barriers were actually fully in place at the very beginning here. Maybe there was a trigger to that thought process. There was maybe a record that was played on the radio that made you think about your school days and of that person in particular, and that person was somewhere else in the UK listening to the exact same radio station, and that song triggered the same thought process in them. The difference being that they acted on it. Got your number from somewhere, through Facebook or something these days. Yeah, that's more likely. Probably Facebook you a message rather than phone you up these days. And they got in touch. And so suddenly you have a coincidence that seems meaningful and seems to have no possible common cause, when in fact there was a common cause that we just weren't aware of.
That doesn't exclude that it was a psychic event.
Oh, absolutely.
Does it?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
No, but it leaves it ambiguous. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it doesn't rule it out. And the problem is, when we're playing these games with skeptics, is the onus on the skeptic is only to prove that other mechanisms are possible. They typically don't have to demonstrate that they did occur that way.
Yeah.
I had a similar sort of experience. I was in the habit of driving home from work with the sunroof open, and I don't know why it came to my mind, but I imagined if a bird flew overhead and dropped its whoopsie, it would fall right through the sunroof into the car. And 3 miles further down the road, it didn't actually come through the sunroof, but it was almost like a squadron of gulls had gone across.
Oh.
It missed the sunroof, fortunately, but
Right.
it's an amazing experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that may indeed
That
be
never happened
psychic.
before.
But that's part of the problem, is that there may be lots of causes. There may be near misses that triggered it for you. You peripherally observed that something similar happened to somebody else. You know, or in the far distance you might have seen that there was a kind of a flock of gulls around, and you thought, hold on a second, there's a chain of thought that goes on here unconsciously. I'm aware that this sunroof is open, what if? And all you get are the kind of products of those thought processes, not the actual details of it. That's part of the problem. And the other example that I sometimes give is something like, for example, if you were to have a dream, and in that dream you dreamed of a plane crashing, and it was quite a vivid dream, and so in that dream you see the plane trying to take off, but it's struggling for some reason. The weather's terrible, there's lots of rain, it's at night, so there's a storm. And as the plane takes off, it just manages to take off, but immediately comes back down again and crashes off the side of the runway. And you just can make out that the tail seems to have some kind of a logo. It's white mainly, but there's some red on it, but you can't make out the details. And then lo and behold, the next day, you see on the TV filmed footage of a plane that's crashed in that exact way somewhere around the world. Immediately you're thinking, well, of course, it could be a coincidence. Planes do crash occasionally. It is possible that most planes have a logo that involves the colours red and white. They're certainly by far more common than any other pairs of colours. That if planes are going to crash, it's most likely that it's going to be in bad weather, and it's going to be during takeoff or landing. So all those features are there. But I mention that at this time because of another factor that we forget about up here, which is that the act of observing the confirming event changes our memory of the dream, and actually causes us to remember the bits that fit with the confirming event and forget the bits that didn't fit so well. So unless we've already got an independent record of it, it becomes transformed to be more accurate than it really was. And similarly, when we're watching the confirming event, we tend to be alerted to the features that fitted with our dream and tend to neglect the bits that don't fit with our dream. So we're selecting at both ends and ending up with a pair that matches much more closely than it really did. Classic example of it, if you want. I may be distracted a little bit later because Northampton Town are playing in the second leg of the playoff semi-final at the minute. But if you go to a football match and you ask fans of the opposing sides to report on the game, you'll get completely different views about how many free kicks there were and how many fouls there were and who was responsible. And it's just in the nature of perception that those kind of things will happen. So unless we have very strong barriers in place at the time that you make a record, a black and white record of your perception, and you have some kind of independent record of the target, then you're always going to be susceptible to those kinds of mergings, those convergences.
Can I just also say, I mean, somebody once said to me that the number of events that are actually happening at any one time across the world, there's billions and billions and billions of events actually happening, it would actually be more unusual if some of those events didn't collide than actually them not colliding.
Absolutely.
And, you know, hence you get your coincidences.
Absolutely, yeah. So
I'm not saying that there isn't anything else,
absolutely.
that has to be.
But the dreams is a really good example because Chris Roe would often say that there are, whatever, 60, 65 million people in the UK. Shouldn't we expect a 65 million to 1 coincidence every single morning that someone among that collection will have something happen to them that's confirmed? Absolutely, that would fit in with it. So we've got certainly those things to think about as well. So what can we do? Well, we can construct more formal studies that avoid some of those problems. That's going to be the key. And the first collection of studies then is going to focus on the idea that altered states of consciousness may be psych-inducive. So we want to have people dream, for example, in this study, and we want to see whether their dreams relate to a target that we've generated for them. But we want to do it in a controlled way that avoids some of those problems about having barriers in place at the very beginning and at the very end, so that it can't be accounted for in normal ways. So the first case in point then is Maimonides research, which is in New York State. Maimonides is a medical centre, but they happen to have a sleep anomalies lab, and during the late 60s and 70s, a number of staff had access to the lab to run ESP studies in there as well. So that allowed them to bring people in to stay at the lab overnight, to sleep as normal, but to be monitored, to measure when they were actually in a sleep state. They worked for that period from 62 to 78, and during that time they were able to run 302 sessions. So that's quite a lot of nights of collecting data from people who were sleeping and dreaming. And they were able to capitalise on the fact that just before this period, it was discovered that when people produce rapid eye movement, so when you're asleep, ordinarily for periods of your sleep, you're paralysed, so you can't act out your dreams, but your eyes are not paralysed. So while you're dreaming, your eyes still move as if monitoring the actions that you're supposedly viewing as part of your dream. And you can watch for those rapid eye movements as an indicator of somebody being in a dream state rather than in one of the other stages of sleep. And so what Azarinsky and Kleitman discovered was if you wake people up at various stages, they're more likely to report having been dreaming when they were in REM, when you woke them up, than these other periods. In these other periods, they're more likely to be woken up and say, I was thinking of something, but not to say, I was having this vivid experience that I was, in some sense, acting out. So quite different. So what that allowed them to do is to bring in a participant, wire them up. We're much cleaner than this now. You're going to need a little headband to measure things like EEG and eye movements. That one there is an EMG, so that measures muscle activity in one of the muscles that controls the eye. And then you can monitor it on a humongous computer like this, as I'm pleased to say, has less computing power probably than your mobile phone. And that monitors this EEG, and when they find that it reaches that characteristic REM phase, and there's EEG aspect of that as well, you kind of, was it theta and a bit of alpha you would get sometime, no, theta and beta, mainly I think it is, when you're in a REM state, so it's a little bit more alert than a deep sleep. And when you get into a REM state, what you can do is you can have somebody look at a target for you, which we want you to dream about. This allows us to control what your target will be, so there can't be any factors that influence it. We can make sure that it's completely randomly selected using some true random process. We can make sure that it's securely isolated from you, so you have no idea what it might be. And we can trigger your sender here, so this is a telepathy session. He's going to be thinking about it and trying to communicate it to her. We'll get him to have a look at this picture when you're most receptive, so when you're actually in REM, when you're actually dreaming. And so he would open the envelope on that first REM period, and you have maybe 4 or 5 REM periods through a typical night. And you would focus on that target in some way, and if you know this person, you'd maybe try and find some kind of point of contact, some association that makes sense for that person. Maybe it's a location you've both visited together, maybe it reflects actors that she particularly likes watching on TV, or there's some way in which you can find some resonance for them. If you're the receiver, if you're the dreamer, all you do is just sleep as normal, as best you can, and when you get towards the end of a REM period, so probably about 20 minutes in, you'll be gently woken, and while still groggy, you'll be asked to report on your experiences. What can you remember about the dream that you've just been having? And that will be audio recorded at the time, and written notes will be taken. And then you can run that through the night. So once you've given as much information as you can be allowed to drop back off to sleep, and you can carry on through the cycle into a deeper level 4 sleep, where you're rather unresponsive, and when you come back up, the next time you're in REM, go through the same process again. Keeping that barrier in place the whole time. So always the sender is separated off from you, never leaves that room. Okay. So then the next day, what we want you to do is to see whether your dreams actually relate to the target that have been chosen for you. So these have tended to use static images, postcards and art prints and things like that. What we've tended to use in more recent times are things like video clips, typically about 1 minute, drawn from various commercial videos, movies and so on, documentaries. I'm going to give you an example of 1 or 2 of these that are taken from our own annals, really, our own records, just to give you a flavour of what these are typically like. Okay, so here's 2 that I've taken that will seem a bit familiar from the SNU session. This is from a very small 20 trial study that I was involved with. I can show you these because the dreamer here was me, and these represent... These are slightly different, so these are not dream lab studies, but they're to give you a flavour of the approach. These are studies in which we keep a dream diary, as I asked you to do, and you write up your dreams in the morning or whenever you wake up through the night, and you bring that along for judging the next day. So for me, this was the whole of my recollection for this particular night, and all I can remember was a sense of being Evel Knievel. I use this sometimes with our undergraduates, and they have no idea who Evel Knievel is. A more mature audience here, so I'm sure we're all familiar with Evel Knievel. Motorbike rider doing tricks and jumps. I have a sense of being at the top of a ramp, looking down at its curve, and the target for that night was... Oh, did that move on?
Yeah, it's gone to golfing now.
Okay. Go back. Right. Oh, don't do that. That's what I wanted. So here's the clip for the first one. Just moved again. This may be the most paranormal thing that happens today, huh?
That wasn't you then, Chris.
That wasn't me, no, thankfully. Why is it Victoria doing well on this? But I think when they made the film, they only had 1 bike in their budget, so they used a little bit of clever editing. It's completely undamaged there. And that time you made it, magically. So that was a bit of a beginner's look. That was the first session in the series. It was a study in which I collaborated with a couple of RAs who were new to doing this kind of research. So they were quite impressed with that as a first night. There seems to be correspondence between the dream and the features of the video. We move on to another trial. This is session 5. This one was also regarded as a hit. So here, on this night, my dreams were, I'm high up looking out of a building. Someone says mudslide, and we see mud sliding down the hillside or mountain and over a building. Image of a ski lodge, looks like the chocolate box, Swiss cottage kind of image. Sense of mountains and snow, strong sense of W or M shape. Okay, so I used that one because, again, that came out as quite a good hit. But in actual fact, literally speaking, nothing that I describe in my dream is represented in the video as you see it. There is no mudslide, there isn't really snow of the kind of Swiss cottage chocolate box type. Sense of mountains and snow, well, they're not really mountains, they're more icebergs, glacier type things. W&M is the vaguest thing that I reported, and you can fit that. And it shows really how prone we are to shoe fitting, that we can be extremely creative in looking at things analogously and seeing similarities even where they're not literally to be found there. And this is always the issue, I think, when it comes to real cases. We talked before about the convergence, but more generally, there is a tendency to shoe fit, for people to creatively see connections or similarities, things that make sense to them, to have a confirmatory bias rather than a refutation bias. So that's part of the issue that we have with this. So what on earth can we do? Well, we can't have the lady, as we had before, just looking at a postcard that shows the target and ask her, well, does that look like your dream? Because she's going to say yes. She's going to creatively find some ways in which her dreams can have similarities with what she sees in front of her. So instead, what we need to do is use our written accounts, our mentations, our descriptions of the dream, and have people rate their similarity, their correspondence to one clip, but then also to 3 others, 3 decoys. And at the time that they're making those similarity ratings, they don't know which are which. So all they know is that they're presented with 4 alternatives, one of which was the target that was being played for you as your target. The other 3 have nothing to do with you, they're just decoys to control for this confirmation bias. Now, in this kind of situation, we've got the richness of the qualitative data, but we can now start to quantify how successful are you. Because we know if dream ESP doesn't occur, if you're really just guessing, then you're only going to pick out the right target 1 time in 4. When you've got 4 alternatives, you'll be right 25% of the time. What we can do is see whether your success rate goes much beyond that 25% when we look at the data. So before we do that, to show you the data from the published record, I thought this is the ideal point for us to look at your dream account. Now, true to my word, as you can see on the account, I'm not looking for you to share any details of your dreams. Maybe later over coffee. I've got some really significant correspondences. I'm very happy to hear about them. But for now, these are kind of personal, private records. But I want you to just have a quick look over your dream account, just to refresh your memory of it. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you 4 video clips, one of which is your target, and the other 3 are decoys. What we ordinarily do is, the way the computer program works is it works with sets of 4. So they're already pre-organized into sets of 4, so that maybe the emotional tone of the clips is quite different one from another. So some of the content is somewhat different, although it's quite difficult with complex materials. So that you're not in a situation where you've got a very vivid, explicit experience, and your heart sinks when you see that it relates to more than one clip. So the clips should hopefully be relatively different from one another. That's the idea. So what we have over here is your target. So I'll give that to my lovely assistant. And it's 17, so I need to come out of here. Okay, so what we would ordinarily do is play you each of the clips, one after another. I'll try and turn the volume up a bit for you as well. And all we get you to do is to watch the video clip and make a note for yourself of any similarities you see between the clip and your dream experiences. So on the reverse of your dream diary, you'll see there's a space in there for you to report for yourself any correspondences that seem meaningful to you. And here's your first choice, so 17A. So that's our first clip. With our participants, we'll be careful to remind them that as well as looking for literal correspondences, so if you have lots of dreams about fish or fishing, fantastic, but maybe the correspondences might be a little bit more creative than that. So if your dreams involve, for example, a lot of hustle and bustle, being surrounded by lots of other people, that kind of relates to that sense of being part of a shoal of fish. Any sense of being in free fall or floating or flying, they've got a sense of that kind of buoyancy that you get with being a fish. Also, there's a sense of predation, a sense of imminent danger. So if there's any sense of that, somebody kind of watching you, those kind of things, we might try and encourage people to give that some kind of credence as well. Keeping in mind that when we're with participants during judging, we clearly absolutely don't know what their target is either. So we're in the same position as them. We know it's going to be one of these 4 clips, but we certainly don't know which one it would be. So that's our first clip. We'll try and get the next one. Oh, it is, that's one, isn't it? So here's 17B. Okay, so with that clip, the violent theme is much more explicit. Also, there are many more artifacts there, so it's very mechanised as a scene. So anything that focused on machinery, those kinds of things, we might try and give some credit for. Also, there the idea that it's an outside scene. So if your dreams are predominantly set outdoors and involve people, we'd maybe see some kind of connection there. So those are the kind of things we might think of beyond the literal that we see in a clip such as that. This is your number 3. That's our third scene, so that's mildly humorous, a bit oddball. There's a romantic theme to that as well. It's set indoors, so those are the kind of features we'd be picking up on there. And our final clip. So this is bad news if you've had nothing so far. This is your last chance.
This is the dream I wanted to have.
You've got a very old video collection here.
This is the dream I have every night.
So that's it. The target that you had last night is one of those four. And what we'd normally do is spend a little bit longer, maybe another half hour or so, reviewing your mentation, recalling the elements of those four video clips, reviewing any that you wanted to see again after you've seen them all at least once, and trying to identify points of correspondence and making fine decisions. So, of course, what we would like is for you to put the target video in number 1 position when you rank order all four of your alternatives, but you can get some credit if we get an abundance of second place positions. If we run enough trials, that's also interesting. And so we take care with each of those choices. So that's what I'd ask you to do now, is based on your own dream, how would you rank order those four clips? Which one would you place as your first choice, second, third, and fourth? And then if you're happy with that, we could do a quick show of hands of your number 1 choice, and let's see if we have a psychic group here today. So if we'll think about number 1 clip first of all. So the first clip then we had was the shoal of fish. Did you place that as your number 1 choice? Show of
Was the
hands.
Evil Knievel first?
Sorry?
Wasn't it the Evil Knievel?
No, that was one of my examples. You can't have
Oh,
that
right.
one.
Sorry.
Yeah. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 for the shoal of fish. The second clip then was the World War II clip. How many people have that as their number 1 choice? 1, 2, 3, 4 again. The third one is the Hugh Grant bookshop clip. Do we have any number 1s for that? We have 1, 2, 3 for that. And the fourth clip is our dancing girls. And
I don't know what you're doing. I have that dream every night.
there we are. So we have 2 for that one. So if my beautiful assistant now will open the envelope, and today's winner is
17C, the bookshop.
So the target from last night was the bookshop. And so if we were unsuccessful, we'd still take time to go back, look at your mentation and see if maybe there were things that we missed, because there's a real danger in studies such as this, that actually whatever you spend most time on during the judging period becomes de facto your target. We've had a number of very impressive missing trials where we've spent a long time, upwards of an hour and a half, reviewing a clip that turned out not to be the target, but had so many correspondences with people's dreams that we felt there was some meaning in there. And there's a danger that what you've done is you've turned it into your target, because you spent so long talking about it and looking at it, and it's just much more vivid psychologically than is the actual target. And when you do the reveal at the end, if it turns out not to have been the target, you're barely watching it when it's played right at the end.
But what if you've got something in every single one?
Well,
That is really relevant.
that is a problem. It is, and it is a problem we have. And there are 2 techniques to deal with it that we've kind of championed at Northampton. One is that quite often in our later studies, we don't make you do the judging. We actually only show you the actual target. But we give your dream diary to an independent judge. And then they get to see 4 clips they're what we call blind. They don't know which is your target and which are the decoys, and they use your dream diary to make judgments on your behalf. But in that way, you get closure, so you only see the target, and you can only have that retrospectively influence your dream.
But what if you're picking up on every single one that you, every four that you play?
Well, that's always going to be possible, but in the real world, it doesn't seem to work that way. So, for example, people don't tend to report psychic experiences that relate to strangers. So there does seem to be an element of discrimination, which simply revolves around intention. And so we very carefully use the wording that we use here, for example, in your dream diary, that says, tonight I will dream, and my dreams will help me to identify the target. And that seems to be sufficient in some way, whether it's to some kind of higher authority, I don't know, but it helps us to focus.
It's just that the two others that you played from your own had nothing to do with my dream, but
Right.
each one of those four had some, I mean, I'm quite
Yeah.
happy for you to have a look at it,
Yeah.
but each one of those four had a connection.
Exactly. And my argument for that first strategy is that wouldn't have happened if, at this point of closure, this point of reinforcement, you only got to see the bookshop. If we never showed you the other three, although there's an electronic record of them, a representation of them on the hard disk, that wouldn't be sufficient to prick into your consciousness and have you dream about them. But showing them to you today as part of your, I'll come to you second, as part of your judgment, really helps prick it into your consciousness and can have that retrospective effect. That's what we would argue. The other thing we can do is we can have an independent judge rank order your mentation, your description, against not just those four clips, but 4 decoy clips from another set altogether. And if you're correct, what we'd expect is all 4 of those will be given higher average ratings than the 4 that you've never seen. So that's the other way. Sorry.
Yeah.
How do you know that this woman, and very surprising on my choice, on my dream, you wasn't dreaming about the clip, but you were having a precognitive dream about you showing the clips now?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
exactly, yeah.
Because if you read my dream, at the end of it, it just says, I think the people may have been soldiers.
Right.
It was written this
Yeah,
morning
yeah.
at 3 o'clock in the
Fantastic.
morning.
Yeah.
So I may have been, I'm not saying I'm psychic or anything,
Yeah.
but I may have been dreaming about
Absolutely, the
this
whole
meeting.
process.
Yeah.
An example of that, don't know what's happened here. An example of that from one of our studies where there were a community of us, there were 4 of us working together, generating dreams, and we had shared targets because we wanted to see how much overlap there might be. On one particular night, we were singularly unsuccessful. But one of the reasons we were unsuccessful is because I never slept at all that night because my sister-in-law was having a baby, and so we were up most of the night waiting for news about how things were going. One of the other participants dreamt all night about rushing up and down a maternity ward and the cries of babies. The person in our study who had those dreams, her name's Louise, and my sister-in-law named their baby girl Louise when she was born the next day. And it's those kind of things, they're not evidential whatsoever. You know, I'm not trying to make a claim about them, but I think there clearly is a sense that when you're a participant in a study, the whole circumstance is part of what's available to you, that in some way could be processed or assimilated, can influence retrospectively what it is you start off with.
Because you don't really know when you dream, because I mean, I'm under the impression that when you dream, dreaming can be out of time, so you and I could have the same dream, but you could be having it at 2 o'clock in the morning, I could be having it at 4 o'clock in the morning, but we're both in the same dream, but the actual time is different, but in dream time it's the same.
Absolutely, yeah. And we could do that as well. We could have more than one dreamer as we have here on the same day, and we could look for correspondences across individuals.
Yeah.
The problem is how you tease that out in terms of chance coincidences. So you need, there are things you can do. Bob van der Castle, he's produced a catalogue of incidents of different themes in people's dreams, so it's very mainstream. So you can look to see how often do people dream about soldiers, and we might get a sense that 5 people here dreamt about soldiers simultaneously on this one night, and they don't usually. Maybe there's something of interest there. But we need to find some way to build that into a more formal study where we've got objective or quantitative data that we can make sense of. You know, just like my maternity story, it's just an anecdote, it's not really evidential. We need to be able to move it on.
Chris, can I just mention an anecdote here? Because
Please, yeah.
this is not one, this was the 4th one about the dancing girls. Sorry to go on about these dancing. What I got is it starts with 2 statues, and it started with in grey light, so they looked like they were made out of statues. Started with 2 statues of people I put from the Belle Epoque, you know, the Moulin Rouge thing. the host and the hostess, and the hostess is holding her skirt, which is what she did, and then they're having a discussion about the club. The music starts, and they said, and I think I've seen the woman from a painting, and there are tourists crowding around the club. I seem to got about 3 hits there, you know. So, and that's the last one, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we do on occasion get really striking misses.
Yeah.
And I think it's exactly this problem is when a clip comes on that makes sense to you, and particularly makes sense to you in terms of your dream.
Yeah.
For a lay member of the public participating in our study, they come away feeling just as vindicated that their prior belief that ESP is real, even though, in terms of what we've got in black and white numerically, is a miss that detracts from that claim. I can very easily understand why we might come away with the counter view of what's happened.
Yeah.
And I think really the only way to avoid that is, as we do in some of the later studies I mentioned, we just don't show you the alternatives.
Yeah.
Because then if you only see the target, you don't open yourself up to that possible channel of communication.
Yeah.
Because, you know, psychically, what's to stop you from saying, oh, last night thinking, okay, what are the 4 clips that I'm going to be shown tomorrow? That's the one I'm most interested in. I'm going to dream about that clip, you know? Even though it isn't the target that's being played, but you are picking up on something about the dynamic of the situation.
I resent that suggestion.
I'll pass no remarks.
It was the grey one, because I can remember the dream, and it said it starts with 2 statues. But, I mean,
No, exactly.
Image,
Well, we've had some amazing misses. I mean, some of the best hits have the quality of somebody who has been shown a video clip and maybe 3 or 4 days later has been asked to describe the clip that we showed them. So they can remember some of the fine detail in exact detail. They can remember the gist of all of it, and they'll get the chronological order pretty much correct. But they'll forget bits. There'll be chunks that are not there at all. That's the quality of some of the sessions that we have. It's not common or garden. It doesn't happen every single time. It doesn't necessarily happen to those who come in with the strongest beliefs that they're going to succeed, or people who are professionally psychic. It can happen to a variety of people, but that's the quality that they have when they happen.
Chris, can I ask you a question? Can you help me on this?
Okay.
20 years ago, I was in bed with my girlfriend. And it was it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and we both woke up at the same. And I wrote a book in 2002, and this is actually documented in this book I wrote in 2002. But I still haven't had any answers on it. And we both woke up at the same time. And I said, what are you dreaming about? And she said, I've just had a really weird dream about your friend Ian Johnson, who incidentally lived in Heswell. And I said, that's weird. I said, I've just had a dream about Ian Johnson as well. I said, what was your dream? She said, I dreamt he went to prison. And I said, that's exactly the same dream that I've just had as well. So we both woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning dreaming that this guy had gone to prison.
Right.
Now, this particular time, he was a nice bloke. He was a smashing rock. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a crook. And a year later, I put the TV on at lunchtime, and it was Granada News, and Ian Johnson had been over to Spain, got himself mixed up with these gangsters who were MI5. It's a long story, and they got into, he said, do you know any printers that can make $1 million bills? American dollar bills. And we can, counterfeit the currency, and then we can buy drugs from Morocco in Spain, sell them, launder the money. And he said, I've got a printer in Birkenhead, who incidentally was my printer.
Right.
So a year later, I put the TV on, news time, and it came on, and it was on Granada local news, Ian Johnson and my printer. And he went to prison a year later. So my question to you, and I've never really had anybody to discuss this with.
Right.
What's the chances of that, and where does that put? How does that rate?
Right.
But actually, she was my wife. I did marry her
Right.
afterwards, but and then I divorced her. But seriously, to wake up at the same time, 3 o'clock in the morning, and have the same dream. And the good thing is, we documented it by speaking to a chap who was a friend of mine and also a friend of Ian Johnson's, and we told him, but we couldn't tell Ian Johnson at the time because it was embarrassing that we dreamt that you go to prison. So we didn't tell him. But we did tell. We did actually tell an independent party, a third party, should I say? So where do you see that, Chris?
Well, there are lots of answers to that. I think fundamentally my position is that I can't have an answer to something like that because when we live in the real world, we live in such a complex environment that includes so many factors that we're either not aware of or that we don't monitor, that we can't fundamentally know what factors might have contributed to a coincidence that we see. And I'm using the word coincidence there in a neutral sense, not suggesting that it's just a random alignment of elements.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's part of our problem. I think there is a big difference between subjective validation, so evidence or proof that might convince us at a personal level, and what we might need for scientific proof.
Yeah.
So, and in my personal view, I think anecdotal cases are the lifeblood of what we do. It's why we do what we do. Because if the designs of studies I talk to you about now couldn't speak at all to your experiences, at least to say, well, yeah, look, actually, when we do studies like this, look, something similar seems to occur, maybe on a more trivial basis, maybe more shallow, yeah, but nevertheless, there's a correspondence between what we're doing and what you're doing, and in our study, we do control for all those factors, so we can be really sure that no other element played a role, that it seems to be something that goes beyond, that needs some new explanation, and that maybe gives you greater resolve that your interpretation is correct.
Yeah, but what's the chances of two people having the same dream at the same waking up at the same time,
but you
and
can't.
that coming to fruition a year later?
But we're back to this issue of, well, you know, if you've got 60 million people.
I've done that with my daughter, and we called the police because we both dreamt that there was a guy in the house, and we actually got the police in.
Right.
Because we were kind of, did we dream it? You know.
And was he in the house?
There was nobody there. There was a window open, but we don't know to this day.
See, again, you see, it may be that at some level you've both noted that the window was open, but not consciously. And then when you're sleeping, suddenly you've got an opportunity for unconscious information to pass through to consciousness and to be embodied.
At the same time, in different rooms.
Yeah, but again, it may be something about this guy that you picked up on at some level, and you made inferences. That's why, and again, I say these not at all to suggest to you that those are appropriate explanations, but more to say our problem always is that it's an open system, and all of these explanations are possible in principle.
That's different from the norm, though, isn't it? To have that. Surely.
Well, I don't know if enough research has been done to find out how common shared dreams are, for example. I don't know how fruition. Well, and again, you see, because we don't do a thoroughgoing survey of that kind of information, and again, because we're not prospectively running that study, if we do it retrospectively, what it means is you selectively remember, and we remember stuff that's meaningful. So the fact that you have a dream that has no relation to what happens to you the next day, that dream is not worth remembering. But if you have a dream that later is confirmed in some way, that ergo becomes a memorable dream. And so immediately, if you're taking a retrospective view, you're slanting things in that direction. And again, that is not at all to say, therefore, none of these dreams contain evidence for ESP. I'm not at all saying that. But what I am saying is, from my perspective, it's futile to look to that information as a source of evidence per se.
Okay.
I would be really interested to talk to you, though, more about the circumstances, because there'll be things there that I absolutely should be taking into account when I'm designing my studies.
Okay.
But the studies...
You better plug it in.
I thought we plugged it in before.
That's another spooky thing. Well, maybe we never got around to it, we're too busy chatting.
Yeah, at the same time. Yeah.
There seems to be thresholds between, say, the animal, vegetable, the different worlds, the human world, the so-called angelic, and they all seem to be mixed up. They're sorting out which side of the fence you're on. I don't like the word barrier so much. Like this world, there's sort of an interchange zone. There's nowhere one influences the other. And same with psychic things. You say, well, you can fall on one side, or you can fall on the other. You say, well, it is a psychic experience, or you can change your viewpoint and just fall on the other side. So it's a very, you can go on forever with it.
Oh, well, I think you can. I think there's something inherent in it that makes it ambivalent or ambiguous.
Yeah.
You know, and people do have this approach avoidance. Sometimes the evidence seems compelling, sometimes it seems quite weak, depending on the thing you're looking at. And I think certainly, more broadly, I think it fits very well with transpersonal psychology, because I think the main thing it does is speaks to this idea of a transcendence beyond perceived barriers. So the idea of being bounded by our physical bodies, for example, you know, that consciousness is seated in the brain. Those kinds of notions are the notions that are challenged by these kinds of data. And so in many ways, somebody like Charlie Tart, for example, would say that the relationship between transpersonal psychology, which is a very spiritual psychology, and parapsychology is the same as that between physics and engineering.
Yeah.
You know, that one is much more about understanding the phenomena, and then the other is more about its application. So maybe that kind of fits in with that. So if we look at studies such as the one that you've now participated in, and we didn't do fantastically well there, we didn't tend to pick out the bookshop as our target.
Some of us did.
Exactly, some of us did. Fantastic, well done to those. I don't know what your prizes are, but Alan's going to take care of that for us. But it allows us, when we conduct enough trials, to see what the cumulative record is. So any individual, even impressive case, is still only anecdote. But when we collect a number of cases that are all collected, the data are collected under rigorous conditions, so we're sure that there are no obvious loopholes that allow for normal communication. Many of these are precognitive studies, so they don't necessarily have a sender sending you the target in real time. It may be that your target is selected after you've dreamt, so it doesn't exist at the time that you dream. Some random process is used afterwards, and then your target is chosen, and then you're shown the target later, that kind of idea. So we can be sure that maybe there's something interesting going on here if we see people performing better than chance. Simon Sherwood, a colleague, and I reviewed those Dream ESP studies, and we came up with this chart that shows you, with the Maimonides lab, how successful they were. And where these red bars go above the 0 point, that's a study in which people were doing better than chance, and the larger the bar, the more successful they were being. And you'll see that there were only 2 studies across 15 studies in which participants performed worse than chance. And interestingly, both of those studies were what they call screening studies. So they simply collected a wide range of participants to see how well they might do, and used that as a basis for selecting people to invite back for the later, more thorough study. So when you take that very wide range, you throw out the net, they clearly captured a lot of people who weren't particularly successful. When they worked more intensively with people who'd started off promisingly, they continued to perform above chance. And then Simon Sherwood and I went on to look at those studies that have been conducted since the Maimonides lab. These tend to be studies which are less rigorous in the sense that we don't have access to dream labs, but they're more like the kind of study that you've just been involved with. So people typically would sleep in their own homes, they would keep a dream diary, they'd be oblivious to what the target might be. Your target could have been anything that could be on video, although we've decided it has to be somewhat dated, nothing from the noughties anyway. But you didn't know that, it could have been anything, so you weren't constrained in how you dreamt, you just dreamt as normal and not worry too much about it. And then you'd come along the next day and we're sure that the way that the targets are selected and the way that they're played is all done securely, so there's no potential for you to access that by normal means. And when you come to the judging, all those data are recorded in a way that you can't then tamper with. So we've got a fairly secure system in those later studies. And what we found in those later studies is, again, a healthy number of them reported people performing better than chance. There were more misses here, but that partly reflects the fact that people start to play around with the technique. They start to vary some of the conditions just to see what might happen to it. And sometimes they're successful and you learn something new, and sometimes they're unsuccessful and you've just taken a false step, really, and there's very little else that you can infer from that. Nevertheless, this later database was also independently significant. So again, in that collection, we can't really attribute success to people just being lucky, to guessing well. It seems to go beyond that. Okay, so that gives you a bit of a flavour of the Dream ESP literature. I just wanted to mention 2 other areas. Alan mentioned, for example, that you've got an interest, or some of you have, in remote viewing, so I was going to say something about some of the RV work that we've been doing. But leading into that, I need to tell you a little bit more about the Ganzfeld. Now, is that a term that you've come across before?
No.
Okay,
Chris,
so,
may I just you've been talking for an hour and a half.
okay.
Okay, so what I'm thinking is we could maybe stop now for some tea and then
Absolutely,
come back
yeah.
with that. Chris has gone through the Ganzfeld
Somebody I
simulation,
recognise.
so we're just going to take
We've
this
got
on
more
further.
naked women.
No problem.
No, we've got fully naked
So we've got this situation that I described before, and the intention is to induce this kind of warm, cosy, fuzzy kind of mental set that's quite conducive to having spontaneous imagery occur. So people get very relaxed, and their task again is simply just report things as and when they happen. So if you hear something peculiar, you hear a snatch of music or something, or you think you hear voices, just report that and let it move on. And there's almost a sense of mindfulness. We were talking about Kabat-Zinn earlier today. This sense of kind of non-judgment about things as well. What comes, comes, and then it goes. You just kind of move on with the flow and don't worry too much about the experience. But while that's going on, and again in a clearer way, rather than relying on using EEG to note whether people are sleeping and dreaming or not, we know in this case that you're in the Ganzfeld stimulation lab and the computer selects a video clip and the sender is in another part of the university, physically separated, so there are strong barriers between the two, and she would be watching your video clip and trying to communicate it to you. She would typically be wearing headphones, so there's separation between the two in that he, Simon here, can't hear anything that she's saying, so he can't get any normal information, but she can hear what he says through her headphones. And so in that way, if he says things which relate to the video clip, she can get excited about that and try and reinforce that. If he's saying things that don't really relate, she can try and switch him off from those as best she can.
Clarify something. Do they know each other, these two? Or they
not always. Not always. Typically they do. People tend to bring buddies along with them. In the States, the evidence was such that people who brought friends tended to do better than people who were allocated a lab person to be their sender. But it does vary. The best pairing seems to be people who are emotionally close. Mother-daughter pairs seem to be about the best. But it depends on the mother and daughter. We've had some mothers and daughters who don't get on particularly well. So. And you can always tell if somebody drags the other person along, if they're really not interested, but they're doing it to indulge them, that doesn't work out so well.
Doesn't that make a mockery of the idea of having a barrier? Because if it's somebody you're close to, what kind of barrier could possibly have?
Well, no. I mean, it's a barrier in the sense that there's no means of normal communication. Crucially, she doesn't get to choose the video. So the video is randomly selected for her, and so she's got no control over that. So they can't rely on their prior relationship to in any way capitalise the chances of success. So all she can do, say she's watching a video clip that is set in North America, she might, for example, recall the time they went on holiday to North America, or how they've always planned to go. So there might be points of connection that wouldn't be available to somebody who didn't know the receiver that they were trying to communicate with. As a quick aside, however, one ingenious study by a guy, Jez Fox, who was based at Liverpool Hope University, he actually asked his senders to keep a running account of what it was they were thinking about as they were trying to send. And he found that they were thinking about the target less than 20% of the time. That most of the time, they started off with good intentions, but very quickly it drifted off. It was nearly lunchtime, they were starving, they were wondering how Northampton Town have got on at the football tonight, all that kind of stuff, and before they know it, they're on a completely different topic, and it takes a little while to get back again. That's what's going on here, and then you have the experimenter, which is me here, and I'm listening to the receiver, and I'm writing a physical record of it, but it's being audio recorded as well on the computer as we're going along. Again, clearly I don't know what the target is. My readout here only says that a clip's been chosen and it's being played for the third, fourth or fifth time and so on. So I'm getting a sense of timings, how far through the session we are, but I don't have a clue which of the 128 or so clips that we have. Then we go through the judging phase as normal. We try and get the receiver to stay as relaxed as possible, so the lights get turned up only a little, so it's still quite dim in there. They're still a little bit woozy, a little bit groggy, and we review their mentation, because just like a dream, people forget most of the things that they've experienced and they've talked about, so we just remind them and give them a chance to elaborate before they get to see the target alternatives, and then we show them the video clips, and again they've got a 1 through 4 choice when they make their guesses. And again what they'll do is, they'll give similarity ratings on something like a 0 to 99 similarity scale, and they'll rank order them. So they'll say, this is my favourite clip, this has got most in common with my impressions, this is my second, my third, my fourth favourite. So here's an example from Chuck Oniton's study. This is from 1990. This was a major study that he conducted at PRL, Psychophysical Research Laboratories in the States. And one of the clips, he reported on some of the better trials from his study. These were a mixture of video targets and static targets. The one I've chosen for you happens to be a static one. There's a man with a dark beard and he's got a sharp face. There's another man with a beard. Now there's green and white and he's in the bushes and he's sort of colonial. looks like Robin Hood, and he's wearing a hat. I can see him from behind, I can see his hat, and he has a sack over his shoulder. A window ledge looking down, and there's a billboard that says Coca-Cola on it. There's a snowman again, it's got a carrot for a nose, and 3 black buttons. There's a white beard again, and this person's target was Coca-Cola advert using modern day kind of Santa Claus, the invention of Santa Claus that they created. So those are the kind of trials that people have. Again, those so-called greatest hits. Kathy Dalton, who was at Edinburgh for a while, and then over at the Rhine Centre, she used to have a set of videos of some of these trials where they would have the video clip as it was playing and the audio, the mentation that people were reporting in real time. And some of those correspondences are absolutely striking. Adrian Parker, who's based in Sweden, he's also got some similar very striking correspondences at the University of Gothenburg. But it's the mathematics that's, again, most important, because each individual case is down to anecdotes and coincidence. There's always a possibility that we're reading more into those similarities than we should, and so fundamentally it's whether people rank the target as their first choice that's most important. We're again working to a baseline of 25% down here, and this is what the database shows us. As we add more and more and more trials over time, we see that these error bars get smaller, so we're more confident about what the real effect size is, and the real effect size is around about 35%, 34%. So it's not amazing, it's not as if every single person that comes to a Ganspot study is successful, but certainly many more are successful than we should expect by chance. And certainly Dean Radin concludes that the odds against chance for this set are 29 quintillion to 1. Okay. And then more recently, Lance Storm, who's based out in Australia, he and colleagues put together a more recent review. Maybe there's something special about how Chuck did his studies. Are we seeing later independent replications in other labs, and they indeed are still finding that people are successful? Again, not in a way that's going to blow people away, quite modest in terms of effect sizes, but still consistently in the right direction. People are doing a little bit better than they should. And as I'll argue in a little bit, I think we're doing a lot better than we have any reason to expect to do, given how people typically design their studies. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. And what they found was, among these later studies, there were 16 what they called noise reduction studies. These were mainly dream ESP, so that fits in with that Oniton model that we had before about focusing attention inwards, and they have an average hit rate of around about 31%, and the Ganspot studies, those later ones that we just looked at, they've actually got a slightly higher average hit rate, just over 32%. In contrast, other studies that have similar features to the design, so they have people give these ongoing verbal reports, they tend to use dynamic targets, those kinds of features, they tend to not be successful at all if they don't have an altered states of consciousness element. These studies down here, so-called free response studies, without noise reduction, they have a hit rate really very close to 25%, and that's what we would expect if they're just guessing. So the altered state of consciousness bit does seem to be important in these studies. Okay. Now, oddly, we also have remote viewing that I believe some of you have come across before and maybe have practiced a little bit. This seems to stand in sharp contrast to the picture that I've painted so far, and I'll explain why when we get down to this next bit. I use, for my working definition, one from Mark Hansel, which is a bit odd. He was based at the University of Wales and was a noted, fairly arch skeptic of parapsychological phenomena, but to my mind still came up with the best definition of remote viewing, and that is that it's the ability to perceive and to be able to describe what would be experienced if one were at some specified distant location. And it's particularly associated with the US military program that's known variously as the Psychic Spying Program, Stargate, Project Scan 8, all these kinds of names. They reflect different projects that were conducted in the US. The US program ran for just over 20 years, and around about $20 million was spent on the program. Keep in mind this was paid for by US intelligence agencies, to whom $20 million is a drop in the ocean, absolutely, and shouldn't really be interpreted as a vindication of the success of that program. It's the kind of amount of money they might set aside for something which has got a very low likelihood of success, but if it were successful would pay great dividends. I think it fits into that category. They typically use psychic spying as a form of triangulation to try and confirm information they were getting from other sources, for example people on the ground, behind the Iron Curtain in particular, also from spy satellites and so on, and so they would see whether they could verify from different sources the same kinds of information. The psychic spying, remote viewing notion was really the brainchild of this guy down here, Ingo Swann. He was a friend of these two. We've got Russ Targ here and Hal Puthoff, and they were both laser physicists working at Stanford Research Institute. They're known to some because of their close work with Uri Geller in the same time period. They were very interested in psychic phenomena generally, trying to find ways to study it scientifically. They weren't particularly gifted as social scientists. Some of their studies are not especially well controlled, but they get better over time. But they were particularly gifted at attracting and having funding to work with people who individually seem to perform extremely well under test conditions. Ingo Swann very much fits into that category. So Ingo Swann visited Targ and Puthoff. He wanted to explore his ESP abilities, and they would do the usual things they'd done with Uri Geller. So put a picture inside an envelope and have him do a drawing of whatever that picture was. And typical of Ingo, he got upset by this, which he felt trivialised his ability. If you want to know what's in the envelope, just open the envelope. Why are you wasting my time with this kind of task? Get me to do something meaningful. For example, give me coordinates for somewhere on the Earth, and I'll tell you, I'll visit that location psychically, and I'll tell you what's at that location. So they tried that out and found that he was remarkably successful, but then started to wonder whether he might be some kind of gifted mnemonist. Maybe he'd actually memorised the atlas in some way, and that's all they were doing, give him some coordinates, and he can tell you where you are. So they started to select locations, but that might be very small islands in large expanses of water, very small lakes in large land masses, these kinds of ideas, and nevertheless still found that he was remarkably successful. So they pitched this to the US military, who then started to provide coordinates for places of interest, particularly in Eastern European countries, and Ingo Swann, and then people that he trained, that he developed, would give information. Okay, what kind of information? Why I mention this now is because they use a rather odd technique. If you check out, for example, something like John McMonagle's book, you'll get an account of how these sessions were typically run. There was no mysteriousness to this, there was no altered states of consciousness, although Ingo was quite a flamboyant character. Many of the others, and John McMonagle certainly, were very much dyed-in-the-wool military people. You know, short back and sides, very rough and tough individuals. They wouldn't have any time for this kind of flouncy creativity, psychic medium kind of nonsense. They were very kind of hard-nosed. And in a sense, their testing had to reflect that. So it was almost interrogative. So really kind of like an interview, but a bit more forced, really, that they would run these. And they would be typically in a normal, ordinary state of consciousness, a normal waking state of consciousness. But there seemed to be aspects of the situation that were intended to gear it towards unconscious responses, rather than what they called analytical overlay. So that sense of you interpreting your experience, giving, if you like, a cognitive account of your impressions. So a couple of things they would do, for example, is they'd have a sheet. This is our sheet, but it's kind of based on some work we did with Paul Smith, Major Paul Smith, who was one of the guys who worked on the program. You would provide your viewer with a coordinate for the place of interest, and so in some of the early sessions these were actual coordinates, very specific coordinates for locations. Later on it was just rather ritualized. It could be any set of numbers or letters would do. It didn't actually have to relate to the target in any meaningful sense. And the viewer would write down those coordinates as they were being read out. As soon as they'd finished writing the last digit of the coordinate, they'd have to produce this little squiggle. So a free-form, quick response, pretty much out of your control. It's almost automatic writing. And this would be their point of contact with the location. And they would try and touch base with that and get a sense of how they respond to touching various points of the squiggle that they produced, what sensations, what tangible impressions it gave them about the location. And that allowed them maybe to segment or demarcate different areas of the site of interest. They'd then move on to a set of short descriptors of the site. These would be typically adjectives to describe different sense modalities. And you'd have to respond immediately in a kind of a word association, almost a Freudian way. First word that popped into your head whenever the question was asked. So you might say, for example, when you think of this site, what taste comes to mind? You'd say sweet, bitter, whatever it might be, salty, anything like that, and that would be the first impression. And you'd have to keep moving in this way, only with adjectives, no attempt at interpretation, no attempt at deciphering what the site might be or what qualities it might have. And so you'd end up, by working through the different sense modalities, you'd then change and say, if you were to reach out and touch this location, what does it feel like? If you were to listen, what sounds do you hear? And whatever came into your head without thinking, those would be the impressions that you'd have to jot down straight away. And then you keep revisiting it. And slowly over time, you kind of build up a connection with the site so that the questions can become a little bit more involved, a little bit more detailed, and you can start to ask people to relocate. So we've got an impression of what it's like from this perspective. What happens if you shift 45 degrees? How does the view change? What happens if you start walking across the site? How does that sound? Is crunchy gravel? Does it feel like concrete? Are you walking on grass? Those kinds of ideas. And you can start to layer the impressions and build up a picture of what you're looking at. Again, we're trying to avoid that idea of interpretation or applying understanding to what it is, because we don't really know. It's just the impressions that we want to work with. Subsequently, we'll try and place those descriptors in some kind of holistic sense of the site, and they typically involve, I jumped quickly, didn't there we are, doing a sequence of sketches of the site. And again, words really are at a minimum, where it's very much an automatic writing kind of sense. You go with your gut feeling, whimsically you engage with the paper, and you do as many drawings or as few drawings as you feel comfortable with, and start to build it up and layer it. And you can see that sometimes the images look very different, sometimes they focus on different specific features, and so on. When you feel exhausted with the process, you'll then produce a written summary, which is your reflection looking back on the words, the descriptors you've used, and the drawings that you've created. What to you seem to be the more salient features of your impressions. It's got an ASC feature to it to me. It kind of feels a little bit like a sense of not being aware of saying the things at the time, and then coming back to them later and recognise, oh, actually, I seem to have said that quite a lot. There are a lot of features that seem to make sense. So I've said hot, and I've also said dusty, I've also said parched. I think there's some kind of commonality here that I didn't know at the time when those impressions were coming to me. And you'd build up an account here, which is an overall description of the site. Most of the work that they conducted was for military operational purposes, and until recently, very little of those data have been available on the public record. More of those data are available now. They did conduct some studies that were published as papers, and the first one that they published was with this guy down here, Pat Price, who is an important subject in a book by Marcello Truzzi called The Blue Sense, which is about police officers who, in the investigation of crimes, have had those intuitive gut feelings about individuals, elements of evidence at a site, a crime scene, those kinds of things, that they, in the trade, particularly in the US, refer to as the blue sense. This psychic impression, this person knows more than they're letting on, or you ask a question during interview that seems to have come from nowhere, and it seems to open a floodgate with the interviewee, the suspect. So Pat Price was known to target and put off. He seemed to be quite adept at this. They ran a sequence of 9 trials with him, and they had the features that for me are important with ORV. That is, they would generate a target location after he produced his mentation. So he would come in, they would have the interview, they'd have to go through that sequence, giving descriptors, layering lots of sketches, and then building a summary account. After that, that's when they would generate randomly a target location from them. They have an array of places they could potentially visit. This would have been in California, within maybe a 50-mile radius. One of those would be randomly selected, and then they would take Price to that location. So in essence, his task was generate impressions about the place that we will take you to later on. Okay? And so he would then go to that location, and that would reinforce, presumably, features of his mentation. He would be there, and he would actually experience that for himself.
Do you ever use a lie detector?
How would we use that here?
Test them out.
Well, in a case like this, it wouldn't be terribly useful in a study like this, because there's no normal means, because it's a precognitive design, there's no normal means by which he could get information about the location. So it might not help here. In other studies that we're not going to talk about today, people do take what are called electrodermal activity measures, which is related to lie detection. And what you can do with those is you can measure non-conscious responses. And there are some studies which are really interesting at the minute, where in a mainstream psychology study, what you might do is wire somebody up to this electrodermal activity apparatus, and you might show them emotionally neutral or emotionally arousing pictures. So it might be violent images, for example, or it might be pictures of spiders, phobics, something like that. And then other pictures would be tree-lined avenues, or it might be beach scenes or something that's quite neutral, fairly bland. And as you might expect, you get a difference in the electrodermal activity depending on whether it's arousing or not. But interestingly, in parapsychology, what we find is that people are showing that response before we've chosen what picture we're going to show them next. So because we're taking a continuous measure of their EDA, and the computer's responsible for randomly selecting what's the next picture going to be that we're going to show in another 200 milliseconds or something, in that pre-period, people are already responding as if they already know it's going to be negative, they already know it's going to be neutral. So that's kind of an aside. So here, for example, a fairly typical trial for this sequence, Pat Price said, well, what I'm looking at is a little boat jetty or little boat dock along the bay. Yeah, I can see the little boats, some motor launches, little sailing ships, sails all furled, and the target on this particular trial was Redwood City Marina. So what the experimenters did was they collected together 9 transcripts from 9 separate trials, and they gave those to an independent blind judge. So the judge would take the transcript for session 1, and they'd have 9 locations, and they'd know that one of those was the actual location for that trial, and they'd rank order those locations. This description sounds most like this, it sounds least like this. And so in that way you can get a rank order of all 9 possible locations. For this set, which was the first series with Pat Price, 7 of the 9 trials were ranked number 1. So it was the best match of any of the possible locations. One of them was ranked as 3, and one was essentially a miss. It was ranked as 6. So clearly, he's getting impressions that seem to relate better to the place that he's going to be taken to later on than they do to any of the other possible locations that he could have been taken to. They did a lot of this work, and there was a government review towards the end of the 90s, and Jessica Utz and Ray Hyman were commissioned to review some of the evidence from this US military work. Ed May, who was the director of this unit after Targ and Puthoff had left, he bemoans the fact that they were given very little of the best data, because still at this time most of it was, what's the word, not confidential, what's the word when it's classified. So most of it was still classified and was not available to them to evaluate. But even among the material that they were able to look at, they found that the 10 best experiments in that set were producing hit rates consistently above chance. Utz concluded that they provided evidence of psychic functioning. Ray Hyman wanted to see independent replications by other people. Because this technique's still quite new, maybe there are flaws in there that I can't spot just yet, but maybe there are still flaws in there that need to be discovered. And the best way to discover those flaws is to have other people attempt to replicate, and they might discover them in process. So he would feel more comfortable if other people attempted this kind of approach, and if they were successful as well. So of course that's what we've tried to do at Northampton, is to do similar kind of work. We started off in about 2005, this was published in 2007, with a smallish study that only involved 14 trials. We changed things a little bit. In that original work, basically Targ and Puthoff had access to many US military personnel. So they could literally screen and pre-test hundreds, if not thousands, of participants, and then requisition those people who seemed to fare well in those early stages and have them work closely with them later on. So we didn't have that luxury. So what we wanted to do was find a way to improve the likelihood that our participants would be successful. So we married the remote viewing technique with the Ganzfeld stimulation thing that we talked about before. So our 14 participants came along, they were pairs of friends, so one would stay with the experimenter and be in the Ganzfeld again, and what they had to do was to generate impressions about their friend. Where is their friend and what kind of things are they doing at that location? In the meantime, their friend would be given directions to a randomly selected location that was within about 5 minutes walking distance from the lab, and they would just engage in the activities there. So for example, if they're in the cafeteria, they'd get themselves a coffee, they might sit with friends and just have a chat as they would normally. Very noisy, bustly kind of atmosphere. If they're on the rugby park, they might run around a little bit, they might bring a ball with them. If they're in the library, heaven forbid, as a student, they might read a book, something like that. And then after 30 minutes, they would return and they'd give feedback, so that the receiver would know where their target location had been. But their description, their impressions over time have already been recorded, and they could be provided then to an independent judge to see if they match up. So it's quite similar to that previous study in the respect that we've got an independent judge who gets the description, and their task is to match it up to the possible locations. In our study, not quite as overwhelmingly successful, but where there are 8 possible locations, we had 4 trials that were direct hits, that the description, that the target location was rated as the best match for the description, and 3 others where it was rated as the second best match. Overall, these results are highly significant down here, and certainly gave us a sense that we should continue with this kind of work. It looks like we're replicating that remote viewing type of an effect. One of the problems is we only use the Ganzfeld condition, so it maybe would have been just as successful if we'd used that normal across the table interrogation kind of situation where people are in a normal waking state. So we needed that as a comparison. Crucially, what I was hinting at before with the Ganzfeld work is we needed to measure whether people respond to having those eye shields and headphones on, because not everybody does. And there's certainly been a problem in the literature that people have assumed that one size fits all. As soon as you put the headset on and the eye shields, everybody drifts off into this slightly sleepy state. But we know full well in practice, some people get so sleepy they fall asleep, and it's not uncommon to hear people snoring in the middle of your experiment. And all you do then is you leave them to carry on sleeping and gently wake them up at the end and ask them if they remember anything from their dreams. But other people are still sitting bolt upright in their seats, not feeling any different from normal at all. And clearly we wouldn't expect them to perform any better because they're not in an altered state of consciousness.
And why red light? I mean, people will associate very different
Yeah, that's
responses
true.
with different coloured lights.
They played with different settings for that at the very beginning. So Chuck Honerton, for example, used sensory isolation to begin with, so had people in blackness. And people were very uncomfortable with that. They felt a bit unnerved, so they didn't enjoy that. Red is typically seen as a warm, cosy, reassuring colour, surprisingly. Although you might think of it, you wouldn't want to paint a room bright red, I wouldn't think, really. Certainly not a bedroom. But actually, when you're experiencing it, it does have that sense of warmth about it, which I think reassures people. Blue lights certainly feel a lot colder.
Is that felt through the skin then, or is it felt seen through the eyelids and the...
Well, you keep your eyes open, so it's just through the actual eye shields, the ping pong balls that we use. Okay. So you keep your eyes open, and it does it, but it feels as if you've got your eyes closed and you're on a beach somewhere in front of a hot sun. That's really the sense of it. So it does feel nice and cosy.
Do you ever use hypnosis to get them into this state?
We haven't, no. I mean, there was an interest in hypnosis in the 70s, as well as that original mesmeric work. A guy called Schachter, Ephraim Schachter, he reviewed that, and there was certainly evidence that people in hypnosis tended to do better than when they weren't being hypnotised. But I think that there hasn't been as much interest in that recently. I'm not sure why, and I'd see no reason why it couldn't be successful.
Yes, rather than use the methods that you're using, the Ganzfeld, it's even easier to hypnotise a subject and take them down so they're still aware, but the suggestions that you can make to them, you can enhance their ability to focus.
Absolutely, yeah. I agree completely. It's just something we haven't done personally.
Maybe I should come down to your university
absolutely,
and do some work with you.
I see no reason why not. Absolutely, yeah, that would work, I think. So we wanted to replicate that, so we tried a second study, a slightly larger sample, a bit more systematic in our approach this time. We had 2 conditions. You might recognise our participant here this time.
Lovely jacket.
And we varied the counterbalance the orders. So for some people they came along and they would do this interrogation type scene where they're filling out that form that I just showed you, the remote viewing form, and they'd have a session, they'd have a target, and they'd get feedback about that target. And then they'd do a second trial with a completely different target. They'd be in Ganzfeld this time, and they'd just report on any ongoing experience in there, and they'd get to see that target. We tried to make the targets a little bit more sexy this time, so what we did was we used Google Earth, which had really just come out on the internet, which was a really nice way to choose much more attractive target locations around the world. So this is the Grand Canyon, for example. We've got some fantastic waterfall places, for example, some very well-known landmarks, that kind of idea. So we've got the pyramids at Giza, for example, is one of our targets, we had at this time. And the interesting thing about Google Earth is it allows you to interact somewhat with that location. So you can kind of zoom around, it's somewhat 3D on computer screen. You can click on people's photographs that they've taken when they're at the location. It's So it's got some of the qualities of being at a place while opening up a little bit more to not having to use just places around campus. So the targets again were randomly selected after the fact, so after people had created their description. So there's no possibility for leakage. Nobody knew the target at the time when the impressions were being generated because the target hadn't yet been chosen. So in the first study that we ran of that type, what we found here was that in the Ganzfeld trials we were getting that average hit rate that I talked about before, that 35%. We'd expect 25% by chance. This is a little bit better than that, and it actually turns out over here that figure means that it's statistically significant. So people were doing significantly better than they should have done if they were just guessing. In the remote viewing condition, so where people are just being interviewed and going through that process, not quite as good, still slightly above chance, but not quite significantly so. Most importantly for us, when we looked at a measure that asked them about their subjective experience while in the Ganzfeld, we found that some of their answers predicted whether they were successful or not. In particular, people who reported that they were more absorbed did better. So the more you were immersed in the experience and were kind of oblivious to the fact that you were in the university, involved in an experiment, that you had to go for lunch later on, the more you'd forgotten about those things and were immersed in the experience, the better you did. Arousal, so the more physiologically aroused people were, the less well they did. The more relaxed they felt, the better they did. And internal dialogue, so that kind of commentary, that little mental chatter that you often have, the more people reported experiencing it, the less well they did. And again, it kind of ties in with absorption. Those two things are correlated. The more you were immersed in the experience and you didn't have that sense of your ego self commenting on everything that you're doing, the better you would perform in our study. And they fitted very well with what we might have expected. So they're the kind of variables that say these people reacted, they responded well to Ganzfeld stimulation, and they've done better. Their descriptions are more accurate. We had a follow-up study with 2 other colleagues. So we've got different personnel here. And in fact, the hit rate is slightly better for Ganzfeld in that second study. So a completely different participant pool, another set of people, and they again were picking, the independent judge was picking the target based on their descriptions. And again, these are descriptions they've produced before we've even chosen the target for them that we're going to show them.
What would you say is happening here, Chris? Because I mean, we get the picture here quite strongly from the figures. What would you describe this is saying about the abilities of human beings, or what the mind is that's able to actually tune into these things?
That's a really big question, given really quite modest data. I'm sorry for this time of the night.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say.
I think we're really very much scratching the surface. You know, we're kind of at the top of Everest, and we're just kind of digging away with a kind of a trowel.
And I remember last time when we heard you were talking about this chap called Bem or Bim.
Yeah, Daryl Bem. Yeah.
And that was the one that actually blew everybody's mind, I think.
Yeah, he's doing more stuff that's to do with kind of unconscious responses and how they might be kind of moderated. I mean, I think my general sense is that it is a workable hypothesis that we do have access to more information from our environment, either that exists now in real time but is physically separated from us, or that may exist in our future or our past, than we ordinarily know. That feeds in to our psyche at an unconscious level, and to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the person, that might bubble through to influence your decisions or your thought processes. So I think that's a working hypothesis. I think what we've got here is enough to say, in my belief, that sense of closure, so taking people from their description through to showing them their target and allowing them a space to find those correspondences and work through them, is enough to enhance their performance. So these hit rates are a little bit better than are typical in a Ganzfeld study, and I think one of the reasons for that is because we only show them the target, and they can, in a sense, act as their own sender across time.
I mean, you've got down there the meditative state described pretty clearly there as being a very successful one for getting information from this field of intelligence, if you like. I mean, that fascinates me, the way it's being replicated from the different sources altogether. But it is actually, I was just considered whether there is any sort of description as to what it might be that's actually out there, which is slowly forming, or would anybody scientifically hazard a guess or anything?
Well, personally, I think in a way, I'm encouraged that this still seems to be consistent with the picture we were talking about earlier on from the Vedas and Sutras, and I think we would go there to get our sense of what is the nature of being a human, what is our psyche, what is consciousness.
Akashic field.
Yeah.
Well, it might encompass that, absolutely. That might be a feature of it.
There's several 40-year standing yoga teachers here who the little hearts are laughing along with that statement, you know, and endorsing that. Yeah, I mean.
But that might be my sense in a way. Yeah. We're taking the first steps on a very long journey. Yeah. And it's very difficult to speculate or hypothesize based on so little data. For my part, I think what we need to do is do some of this lower work here, which is can you start to characterize the experience a little bit more? Are there characteristic features that might speak to that mechanism? Yeah. And that moves us a step forward. But as we've been talking about over coffee, for example, I think if that mechanism were purely materialistic in orientation, so it's all about, I don't know, how active a central nervous system you've got, I think it possibly would still be kind of missing the point. Yeah. I'm very open to the idea that there might be at least one chapter of this story which isn't communicable in materialistic terms. Yeah. And that's where I would be.
I was just wondered about the signal, because if you're seeing an image of something, I mean, we consider that images come through the eyes, recorded in the mind and scrambled or whatever. But if you're seeing something that you've never seen before, you must be making an image which is based on light, but there's no instrument at that extreme sending the messages back. Yep. How does it record it in anything that we can understand? You know, that's what I find fascinating.
Well, there was some talk earlier about Les Lancaster, and Les is very much a proponent of a top-down visual processing model. Right. And here before we were talking about how people often talk about seeing is believing, when in fact believing is seeing. Yeah. We see what we expect to see, not necessarily what's really there.
Yeah, Sheldrake too is a
exactly. Yeah. And I think all of those things fit together when we think about top-down. Yeah. And Les would argue that, you know, top-down isn't necessarily restricted to the brain. So you're not talking necessarily just about higher cognitive functions imposing on more crude sensory processing mechanisms. Maybe there's a higher top-down process going on as well. So that leaves that somewhat open, I think. You know, I think it's very difficult in this day and age to talk in terms of a very passive perceptual process, whether that's hearing or seeing, because we're not getting the data to create the phenomenal experience that we have. Yeah. You know, we're adding a lot to our experience.
You mean the quality of the actual, the visual response?
Well, both. I mean, quality is completely impossible to explain, in my view, thus far, in physiological terms. But I think it goes beyond that. It's down to trivial things such as, you know, your visual field is completely in colour, when of course we know that your retinal field isn't completely in colour. You don't have colour, whichever ones it is, rods or cones, in the periphery. You've only got colour vision in the central foveal region. It's those kinds of features, but we're not aware of that. We commonly see things that are not truly there. We see what we expect to see. Fits in very well. So, finally, sorry for keeping you all so long. Conclusions and recommendations. I would say that incorporating altered states induction still seems to be a useful method for eliciting extrasensory perception effects. So there seems to be something special about those altered states. And I think it is the porosity of its relationship between the conscious and unconscious aspects of mind. Care needs to be taken when varying from standard approaches. We've still got a very superficial understanding of what we're working with, and so we're not really aware of the effects of the changes that we do make. And I think psychologically, again, as I've been saying to some people, how you present a task to your participants dramatically changes the nature of the task. You know, in the most subtle of ways. It's incredibly fine a process to work with real live human beings who've got their own intentions and expectations when they come to your lab. You can't treat them as data generators who are just going to turn up, do their thing, and then go away again. It's an incredibly subtle interaction. Researchers need to particularly ensure that they recruit people who respond to the induction method. There's no point claiming that altered states are important and then having a third of your participants who are not in any form of altered state. That makes no sense at all. Which is why, as I said before, we're actually getting stronger effects than we've any right to expect. And we should focus on what it is about these shifts that might lead to that better performance. stop treating the technique as if it were some sacrosanct ritual, and start to unpack it a little bit and see which of the elements are the important bits. And that's enough from me. Thank you for your time.
Have you got time for some questions? It's
Oh.
10 o'clock now,
Right.
chaps.
I've got just one question. You've some remarkable impartial clinical presentation you've given. But if I was to have dreamt what you dreamt as being Evel Knievel and seeing a mudslide, it would have been enough to convince me, and I wouldn't need to convince anybody else. I just wondered whether it convinced you that there is something significant about it for yourself.
I think there are different kinds of conviction. I'm quite comfortable with it. I mean, I don't think of myself as being particularly gifted at the same time. I think much of it is down to psychological deception. It's deceiving yourself into not realising that you're responsible for being psychic. I think many of the techniques that we use are successful insofar as they allow people to behave naturalistically, and that anybody could do what we see participants doing, if only we get them in the right frame of mind. But as soon as people start thinking about being psychic, a whole range of defences kind of rise up and, you know, act to undermine that process.
Yes, but you weren't thinking of yourself being psychic, and yet you had these two wonderful.
Well, yeah, but they get diluted. You know, there are lots of other trials that were abysmal failures in that same
Well,
sequence.
they do happen. They do happen.
Exactly, and you very quickly end up in that same situation, as we have with any spontaneous psychic event, where you start to doubt the import of the experience. You know, so if you've had a bereavement type of experience, for example, that you begin with wondering whether that might be some attempt at communication from the deceased personality, and you might think you've got really strong evidence of that, and lots of people report that during bereavement processes. It very quickly becomes diluted over time. You kind of slightly defocus in some way.
It does, yeah.
And I think these fall into that category. You know, I think scientists are much happier talking about p-values and effect sizes, and much less happy talking about the implications of the phenomena they're talking about.
Alan and a group of us have had some remarkable successes here with remote viewing. But then we might have been patting ourselves on the back too much, got up into the ego centre and lost whatever it was, the state of being that we had when we were successful.
I think there's a need for that disinterest still. And I think the more that you think of it as kind of, what we say, kind of fueling your ego, I think, yeah, the more self-destructive that would be. I mean, there's a really nice example of that from Targan Put Off, where one of their remote viewing studies was an associative remote viewing, where they tried to predict silver futures, silver futures market, and they actually made something like $50,000 the first time they ran such a study, with an outside investor putting up the cash, and they split the winnings between the two of them. And they tried to repeat it, and they lost pretty much $50,000 in the second sequence. And so there is, you know, these adages about, you know, not using this for your own personal gain. Yeah. They do seem to hold to a degree, although a colleague Simon Sherwood and I, we did do a very short Dream ESP study in which we tried to predict winners of horse races, and by the end of the sequence we'd won enough to buy a pint each. That seems to work out okay. Which, if you know the way bookies hedge the odds, that's quite an achievement.
Okay, Chris, as a scientist, taking religion out of the equation, what's your overall personal view on mediums with the work that you've done so far? Your personal view.
I don't think you can take spirituality out of the equation, because I think where I am, you end up with a model of psychology that necessarily has a spiritual component.
Okay.
That can be expressed in a variety of forms, which superficially might seem to be mutually contradictory. But I suspect that at a deeper level, they're not at all. So I guess where that leaves me is in being very comfortable with mediumistic claims without necessarily being in a position to verify any individual's claim.
And science will eventually get the answers, won't they, do you think?
I think science is a very good self-correcting mechanism that mainly works to protect its own borders, and it takes profound effort or overwhelming evidence to force a kind of paradigm shift.
It's great though that science is actually working with the esoteric though, isn't it? I mean, because in the past, you know, alchemy was born. In the past, people would not, would you know, would be very, very well divided. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
But I think now the actual fact that we can, you know, look. Well, I think everybody in this room is interested obviously in the subject that we're discussing tonight.
Absolutely.
But to be able to look as a science and have an open mind with the esoteric, I think it's moving forward. So, do you think that? So the answer to the question
I don't
put to you is,
my problem is that I'm not sure that it is moving forward. I think
so?
One or two individuals who might have sympathy or be open doesn't suggest that science is a practice.
It depends on the agenda as well, doesn't it? I mean, of science. I mean, if science has got the agenda to, you know, to say let's bring this out into the open and prove that it's correct. But for the same measure, you will have science that's trying to say, well, look.
But it's always, in the past, it's always been spirituality and science and a massive divider, right? I think nowadays more people are more having an open mind to bring science in with the spirituality. That's my personal
I think there are
view.
big movements, particularly among the medical community.
Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I see less evidence of movement among the psychological community, outside of psychotherapists and counsellors, for example. I don't see any movement at all. And I think many of those gates are as well kept as they ever were. So you don't see any of this kind of research being funded from the government purse, from mainstream kind of funding sources. The main funding councils don't support any of this work. It's very difficult to get any of this published in mainstream journals.
Right. Okay.
So there's a long battle. There are minor victories, and an important minor victory in my view is that one of the main A-level syllabuses, the AQA psychology syllabus, now includes a section on anomalistic psychology, which was primarily intended to introduce ideas of what seems psychic but isn't, but actually still provides a foothold to say, that's all very well and we need to understand how we might be fooling ourselves, but there is a little pocket here as well of really interesting research that's very difficult to explain in other terms. And, you know, 50,000 people take A-level psychology each year, and AQA is the largest syllabus that they take among those, that they've got the largest proportion of students. So that's somewhere in the region of 30,000 students who could have been exposed to anomalistic going into universities each year. That's where we've got to devote our attention. It's a waste of time dealing with editors, dealing with chairs of funding councils, because their minds are already set.
Right.
But if you work with the next generation who are brought up open to this idea, or at least not kind of antithetical to it, you know, but antipathetic to it, I think that's what we want.
I don't see how mainstream science can get involved in a subject like this, an area like this, without being profoundly transformed by it.
But they don't need to be engaged with it without being experts in it. Richard Dawkins is an expert on the paranormal without having read any journals on the subject, and is quite happy to pronounce that it's all nonsense.
But it's not really engaged with it, is he? You know, he hasn't really engaged with the subject at all. He says he has, but he hasn't engaged with it at all.
But he's recognised as a scientific expert, and among the kind of lay populace, his opinion still carries weight. Brian Cox is another, who in tweets has been very dismissive of this whole subject, and he knows nothing about psychology.
Yeah, and their approaches don't strike me as being scientific at all.
Exactly. So it is very peculiar, I think, to see that.
Can I just say though, do we not, all of us, as you know, scientific and non-scientific communities, if science says something that backs our own ideas and philosophies, then we applaud what they're doing. But as soon as they start to say something that, say, disproves it, or, you know, contrary to what we believe, we say, well, it's like, you know, they're obviously, you know, kind of stuck in their own mindset.
Absolutely.
And invariably, that is the relationship between, if you like, the spiritual and the scientific. When they kind of are together and saying similar things, they are together. But
well, science was born out of alchemy, wasn't it? Or was it the other way around?
Well, no, it was just. I just think that alchemy became science, didn't it? In the sense that it put a lot of things down that it believed in and replaced it with what is now kind of more modern science.
Most of the early scientists were alchemists at the same time, but it's not quite the same thing. Yeah. But I mean, the reason why they do it is because it's very, very difficult to formulate something which will explain a lot of the phenomena. I mean, why I mentioned that thing about Bem, because he was a scientist. I mean, he's a theoretical physicist, isn't he?
No, he's a social psychologist.
Ah, right.
I mean, the story of Daryl Bem is really interesting. He's somebody whose whole career was spent in Ivy League universities or top 20 times higher world-ranked universities in the States. He's never been outside of that circle. He's incredibly well connected. He's been on editorial boards for some of the major journals in the US. And he has the proud boast that every single paper he's ever submitted to a journal has been published in the first journal that he sent it to, which is almost impossible to have happen.
Yeah.
So really, really well connected. And yet people treat this as some kind of peccadillo, really. It's that, you know, here's a genius, he's done such profound work, but he's always had this psychological weakness. He's got a blind spot when it comes to the paranormal. He's not applying his normal critical acumen. You know, it's all Hans Eysenck in this country is a case in point. Incredibly well-known personality psychologist, mainly based at UCL, I believe. He was always interested in psychical research, as he would call it. He published in the SPR journal back in the 60s.
He did a paper on astrology.
Exactly, he did. And again adopted a true scientific approach to this, which is to suspend prior judgment, evaluate the evidence on its merits, and, you know, if you apply a systematic method, you'll discover the truth.
The thing that got me about Bem was why I think it terrifies people, because it terrifies me as a teacher. You know, when you said that they gave these students an exam, and then, without marking it, they then allowed them to revise after they'd sat it, and the ones that revised after they'd sat it did better in the exam than the ones who didn't revise after they'd sat it. Now, that is amazing. I mean, statistically it came out over and over again, and he is, you know, his statistics are absolute, and he just, when you have something like that, what the hell can you do with that sort of information? I mean, because it's dynamite, isn't it, really? And at the same
You
time,
can't really explain it, can you? That's the whole point.
Yeah.
But
We're attempting to explain these things all the time, and they're not explainable. What happens is, whatever conceptual framework you bring to it breaks up as you engage more with the material.
Right.
That's the most beautiful, striking thing about it to me.
Right.
I rejoice in that, because it's a throwing off of this kind of like great big cage of assumptions that we drag around the world with us and end up seeing what we expect to see, not what's there.
Yeah.
It blinds us. And this stuff is so great to bring out because it breaks everything apart. Hallelujah.
It's incredibly difficult to be a true scientist. All of us have those prejudices and biases, and they colour our perceptions all the way down the line. We feel personally slighted when somebody criticises a method of our study or the analysis of the outcomes. And if we were true scientists and could be so, we could remain separated from that. Because I think fundamentally the world is as it is. I think I said this at the SNU. The world is as it is. So whether we argue for it or believe it to be so or not is neither here nor there. It just is as it is. And surely it's in all of our best interests to understand it for what it actually is, rather than what we would prefer it to be. That's my sense. Well, yeah.
Great. Have a great night.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.